She threw the dare like a woman who never loses. One smile, one challenge, one moment she was absolutely certain she controlled. But Ethan didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He leaned in slowly, not to win, not to prove a point. And in the space of 3 seconds, everything Claire thought she knew about herself quietly collapsed. Some stories begin with fireworks. This one began with a kiss that felt dangerously like a beginning. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The party was exactly the kind Claire thrived in. 40-something people packed into a penthouse on the Upper East Side, champagne catching the light from a chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars, conversation bouncing off marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, with Manhattan glittering 20 stories below. Claire moved through it all like she was born for this, shoulders back, smile sharp, the kind of presence that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. She had that effect. She knew it. She'd learned early that confidence worn like a second skin was the most powerful thing a woman could carry into a room. By 11, the inner circle of their work group had thinned. Marcus had left early, citing a flight. Priya had disappeared toward the bar and never returned. Claire found herself drifting toward the terrace, not out of loneliness, never that, but because the city at night did something to her that no conversation ever quite managed. It made her feel both enormous and perfectly small. She was leaning against the railing, heels pressing into the stone, when she heard the door slide open behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She recognized the footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, the kind that didn't apologize for the space they took up. Ethan Cross had a way of entering a room, or in this case a terrace, that made the air rearrange itself slightly. "Escaping already," he said, stopping beside her, close enough that she caught the faint trace of cedar and something warmer underneath. His tie was loosened. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked like a man who'd decided the night was worth staying for. "Strategically relocating," Claire said, eyes still on the skyline. "There's a difference." He laughed. Low, genuine, nothing performed about it. "Of course there is." They stood like that for a moment, the city humming 40 floors below them, neither one in a hurry to fill the silence. That was something she'd noticed about Ethan from the beginning. He didn't rush words. Most people, when conversation paused, panicked, reached for something, anything, to fill the space. Ethan let silence breathe, like it had its own value. It was, she had to admit privately, slightly unnerving. "You know what I think?" Claire said, turning to look at him for the first time. His profile was all sharp angles and steadiness, eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance. "I think you followed me out here." He turned then, slowly. And those dark eyes settled on her with the kind of focus that made her want to take a half step back and also not move at all. "I think," he said quietly, "that you said that hoping I'd deny it." Something shifted in her chest. She covered it with a smile, the one she kept for moments like this, polished and unreadable. "Careful," she said, tilting her chin up just slightly. "You're starting to sound confident." "Am I wrong?" She held his gaze for a beat too long. Then, because she always attacked before she could be caught off guard, she said it. The dare. Light and easy, like it cost her nothing. Like it was a joke. Like she already knew how it would land. "You know what?" she said, her voice dropping into something playful. "I dare you to kiss me." The city kept humming. Somewhere inside the party, someone laughed too loudly. The wind moved through her hair, and Claire stood there with that practiced smile, absolutely certain of how this would go. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he tilted his head just slightly and said in a voice low enough that she felt it before she understood it, "A joke is what you're pretending this is." And then he kissed her. Not fast, not nervous, not the way men kissed when they were trying to impress. He kissed her the way someone moves through a door they've opened 100 times, certain, unhurried, like he already knew what was on the other side. It lasted only seconds. When he pulled back, his eyes found hers immediately, calm and steady, like he hadn't just rearranged something fundamental inside her. Claire didn't speak. For 3 full seconds, 3 seconds that felt architectural, like they were holding something up, she simply stood there, heart loud, breath short, the skyline blurring slightly at the edges. She was still trying to remember how to look unbothered when he turned back toward the glass door and said almost gently, "Come back inside when you're ready." The door slid closed behind him, and Claire stood alone on the terrace, the city witnessing everything, her carefully constructed composure somewhere on the floor, and the strange, terrifying feeling that whatever had just started out here in the dark was going to be very difficult to pretend away. The corporate retreat had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. Claire had looked forward to it in the way she looked forward to most work obligations, with the specific, contained enthusiasm of someone who was very good at their job and knew how to make any environment work in their favor. Monterey, a resort on the Pacific. 3 days of strategy sessions, team dinners, and the kind of forced proximity that either built teams or quietly destroyed them. She had packed efficiently, brought 2 blazers, one for the first presentation, one for the closing dinner. Her laptop bag was organized by priority. Her coffee order was already saved in the resort's app. Claire did not do unprepared. What she had not prepared for was discovering, somewhere between the elevator and the 3rd-floor corridor, that the room directly beside hers belonged to Ethan Cross. She found out the way you find out things you weren't supposed to, by rounding the corner just as he was sliding his keycard into the door marked 318, 1 room down from her own 319. He looked up. She stopped walking. There was a half-second of something that wasn't quite surprise on either face. "Of course," she said. "I didn't request it," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, not quite a smile. Something more restrained, and therefore somehow worse. "I didn't say you did." "You implied it." "I don't imply things, Ethan. I say them directly or not at all." He pushed his door open and glanced back at her once, something unreadable in his expression. "Good night, Claire." She walked into her own room and stood in the middle of it for a moment, jacket still on, bag still over her shoulder, staring at the wall that separated their rooms like it had personally offended her. The resort was objectively beautiful. She could admit that, even through the low-grade irritation humming somewhere beneath her sternum. The room had wide wooden floors, a king bed dressed in white linen, and a sliding door that opened onto a private balcony over the Pacific. The ocean was right there, massive and grey-green and indifferent, the kind of view that made your problems feel briefly embarrassed about themselves. She had dinner with the team, made conversation, laughed at the right moments. Nobody would have noticed anything different about her, which was exactly the point. By midnight, she was in bed with her laptop, pretending to review slide decks, actually staring at the ceiling. By 1:30, she gave up. She pulled on an oversized, cream-colored sweater over her pajama pants, pushed the balcony door open, and stepped out into the night air. The cold came at her immediately, sharp and salt-heavy and clean in a way that Manhattan air simply never was. She breathed it in, both hands curled around the railing, the ocean below her nothing but sound and darkness and the occasional white fracture of a wave catching what little light existed. She didn't hear him at first. It was the small sound of a glass being set down that made her turn, and there he was, Ethan, on the balcony directly beside hers, separated by nothing but a low wooden partition and perhaps 3 feet of ocean air. He was in a grey Henley and dark sweatpants, no shoes, a glass of water in his hand, looking out at the sea with the expression of a man having a conversation with it. He hadn't noticed her yet. She watched him for a moment, longer than she should have. There was something about him in this context, stripped of the office, stripped of the meetings and the blazers and the performance of professionalism, that was different, quieter, more solid somehow, like the version of him she was seeing right now was the one that actually existed beneath all the rest. Then he turned and found her immediately, as if he'd known she was there all along. Neither of them spoke. The ocean filled the silence, waves pulling in and breathing out, patient and enormous, doing what it had done for 1,000,000 years without needing any of this to make sense. Claire pulled her sweater tighter. Ethan set his glass down on the railing. They stood like that for a long time, side by side across that small divide, not looking at each other, not filling the air with words that would have made it smaller. And it occurred to Claire, somewhere in the second or third minute of that silence, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd been this honest with another person without saying a single word. That thought scared her more than she expected. She didn't leave, though. She stayed until the cold became too much, and even then she was slow about it. The second day arrived wrapped in fog, not the thick, disorienting kind. The soft kind, the kind that blurred the edges of everything and made the world feel temporarily smaller, more contained, like the universe had pulled its walls in just slightly and decided that for now this stretch of California coastline was all that existed. Claire stood on her balcony with her first coffee of the morning and watched the mist move across the water in slow, deliberate sheets, and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Peaceful wasn't quite right. Unsettled wasn't either. She settled on awake. More awake than usual. More aware of the specific weight of the air against her skin, the sound of the waves below, the warmth of ceramic against her palms. She'd slept better than expected, considering. The morning session ran 2 hours. Projections, Q4 targets, a debate about regional expansion that got lively somewhere around the 40-minute mark. Claire contributed what she needed to, sharp and focused, the version of herself she'd spent years perfecting. Ethan sat 2 chairs down and didn't look at her any more than usual, which was somehow both a relief and its own specific kind of frustration. After lunch, the group fractured. Marcus and 2 others went toward the spa. Priya and the junior team claimed the terrace bar. Someone mentioned kayaking, which Claire declined with a smile that left no room for follow-up questions. She wanted the coastal walk, the long one, along the rocky bluff that wrapped around the edge of the resort property and continued south toward a smaller cove. She'd read about it in the welcome packet the night before, with the focused attention of someone determined to have at least 1 hour entirely alone. She was 20 minutes in before she realized she wasn't. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of shoes on rock slightly behind and to the left, unhurried, not trying to catch up, but not falling back either. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, both hands loose at her sides, eyes on the water below where the waves were doing their relentless work against the stone. He fell into step beside her naturally, like gravity had made the decision for both of them. They walked without speaking for a while. The path narrowed at one point, forcing single file, and then opened again into a wider stretch where the view expanded dramatically. The full curve of the bay visible from up here, the fog still hanging offshore like it was waiting for permission to leave. Claire's hair kept catching in the wind, and she kept pulling it back with one hand, which was both annoying and oddly grounding. The rock dropped sharply ahead. A 3-foot descent onto a lower shelf, wet from the morning tide, the kind of thing that required a hand and a moment of trust. Ethan stepped down first. Then he turned and extended his hand to her. She took it, and he helped her down, and then he didn't let go. Not immediately, not after a polite second or two. He simply kept her hand in his as they continued along the lower shelf, fingers loosely interlaced, like this was something they had always done. Like it required no announcement, no negotiation, no moment of acknowledgement. Claire didn't comment on it, didn't pull away. She was intensely aware of the warmth of his hand, spreading slowly up through her wrist and into her arm, of the way their pace matched without either of them trying, of the small adjustments his grip made whenever the rock surface shifted beneath her feet. She thought about saying something light, something that would reframe this into something manageable. She didn't. By the time they reached the small deck that jutted out over the lower cove, weathered wood, 2 benches, a view that deserved its own silence, the fog had thinned enough to see the horizon. They sat. The ocean moved below them. A pelican passed with extraordinary patience through the frame of the sky. Ethan looked at her sideways, then out at the water, then back again. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to regardless," she said. That quiet, almost smile. "What are you actually afraid of, Claire?" She laughed, reflexive, deflective, the sound of it too quick to be real. He waited, didn't fill the space, just waited, with that particular brand of stillness that she was beginning to understand wasn't patience so much as certainty. Like he already knew the laugh was armor and was simply waiting for her to decide whether to keep wearing it. She looked out at the water for a long moment. "Honestly," she said finally, "that's all I'm asking for. I'm afraid of wanting something I can't control." She said it quietly, like she was testing the weight of the words outside her own head for the first time. "I'm afraid of being the person in the room who wants something more than the other person does. I've been that person before. I didn't like who I became afterward. The ocean offered nothing in response. It just kept moving, indifferent and eternal." Ethan was quiet for long enough that she almost regretted saying it. Then he said, "That's not fear of wanting. That's fear of being seen wanting." Claire turned to look at him. Something in her chest tightened in a way she couldn't immediately account for. Not painful exactly, but close. The kind of feeling that arrives when something true lands somewhere tender. Her eyes were doing something she couldn't entirely stop. She looked back at the water before he could read too much of it. His hand, she realized, was still holding hers. Neither of them had mentioned it. The storm arrived without much warning. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted from pale grey to something darker and more decisive. The kind of sky that doesn't negotiate. The wind picked up along the bluffs first, bending the coastal grass flat. And then the rain came, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a door being thrown open. Within 20 minutes, the resort had pulled its outdoor furniture inside, cancelled the evening bonfire, and redirected everyone toward the main hall with the quiet efficiency of a staff that had seen this coastline do exactly this before. Claire stood at her balcony door and watched the Pacific turn violent. It was objectively magnificent. The waves were enormous now, white and furious, throwing themselves against the rocks below with a force that she could feel faintly in the soles of her feet through the floorboards. The rain hit the glass in sheets. The fog was gone, replaced by something rawer, more honest. Just wind and water and the particular electricity that lives in the air before and during and after a storm. She changed into a burgundy wrap dress that she'd packed for the closing dinner, deciding it worked just as well for whatever the evening had become. Heels she left in the closet. The main hall had stone floors, and she had no interest in performing for a storm. She went with flat leather sandals and her hair down, still slightly damp from the day, and told herself this counted as relaxed. The main hall had transformed. Someone on staff had lit every candle available, dozens of them, clustered on tables and along the wide stone windowsills, throwing warm, unsteady light across the room in a way that no overhead fixture could have replicated. A musician had appeared in the corner, a man with a guitar and a voice that suited the weather, low and unhurried. The team had gathered in clusters, drinks in hand, the enforced intimacy of a storm doing what 3 days of team-building exercises rarely managed, making everyone slightly more human. Claire found Marcus at the bar, got a glass of red wine, and spent 40 minutes in easy conversation. Easy because Marcus was genuinely funny and asked nothing of her emotionally, which was exactly what she needed after the afternoon on the bluff. She was aware of Ethan across the room the entire time, not in an obvious way, not in a way anyone watching would have noticed, just a background awareness like knowing where the exits are, automatic, constant, something her attention kept returning to without her full permission. He was talking to 2 people from the strategy team, dark sweater, dark trousers, a glass of something amber. He laughed at something once, and she caught the sound of it from across the room above the guitar in the rain, and felt it in a way that was disproportionate and inconvenient. It was around 9 when he appeared beside her. Marcus had drifted away. The musician had shifted to something slower, the kind of melody that changes the temperature of a room incrementally, almost without anyone noticing until they're already inside it. "Dance with me," Ethan said. Not a question. Not quite a command either. Something in between. An offer extended with enough certainty that refusing it would have required more energy than accepting. "That's your strategy?" Claire said, turning to look at him. "No preamble? No negotiation? Would preamble have worked better?" She considered this genuinely for a second. "Probably not," she admitted. He almost smiled, extended his hand. She took it, because she was tired of pretending she didn't want to. The floor had cleared slightly toward the center, a few other couples already moving slowly in the candlelight. Ethan led her there without hurry, and when he turned to face her and brought her in close, one hand warm and certain at the small of her back, the other holding hers against his chest, the distance between them collapsed in a way that felt both sudden and entirely inevitable. He didn't pull her aggressively close. He didn't need to. The hand at her back was just present, steady and warm through the fabric of her dress, not pushing, just there, the way something is there when it has decided it belongs. She could smell him, cedar and something clean underneath, and the faint warmth of his skin so close to hers. She became very aware of her own breathing. The music moved slowly. The rain kept hitting the windows, dramatic and relentless. The candles threw shadows that stretched and shifted with the draft. He didn't try to kiss her. That was the thing she hadn't expected. He simply held her and moved with her and looked at her, really looked, the kind that doesn't scan or assess but simply sees. And in his eyes was everything he hadn't said out loud. Every moment on the terrace in Manhattan, every silence on the balcony, every step along the bluff with her hand in his. All of it, right there, entirely visible. Claire felt the room narrow to just this. Just his hand on her back, and his eyes on her face, and the guitar and the storm and the candles burning low. She didn't look away. She should have. She knew she should have. She didn't. Sleep had been theoretical. Claire had lain in the white linen for hours, the storm quieting gradually outside her window, like something that had said what it needed to say and was now done with it. The ocean settled. The rain thinned to nothing. The room went completely still in the way rooms only do in the very early hours, that specific silence that exists between the end of night and the first suggestion of morning, when the world holds its breath without knowing why. By 5:15 she gave up entirely. She dressed quietly in the dark, black joggers, a soft ivory hoodie, her hair pulled back loosely. No mirror check, no strategy. She picked up her phone out of habit and then set it back down, which felt like a small act of courage, and slipped out of her room into the empty corridor. The resort was completely still. No staff yet, no sounds from other rooms, just the faint hum of the building settling into itself and the distant, constant conversation of the Pacific beyond the walls. Her flat shoes made almost no sound on the wooden floors as she moved through the lobby and out through the side entrance toward the private stretch of beach that belonged to the property. A narrow crescent of dark sand tucked between two rock formations, accessible only to guests, sheltered enough from the wind to feel like a separate world. She almost stopped when she saw him. Ethan was already there. He was standing at the water's edge, shoes off, the cuffs of his dark pants rolled up, the wet sand dark around his feet. His hands were in the pockets of a charcoal jacket, his face turned toward the horizon, where the sky was just beginning its slow negotiation with the sun, deep grey softening at the edges, the faintest suggestion of colour bleeding in from the east like something cautious and new. He looked like he'd been there a while. Claire stood at the top of the small dune for a moment, before walking down. He heard her approaching. The sand shifted differently under weight, and turned just enough to confirm it was her, before turning back to the water. She sat down on the dry sand a foot or two from where he was standing, pulled her knees up, and looked at the same horizon he was looking at. He sat beside her after a moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold morning air. Neither of them spoke. The sky changed slowly. It did it the way significant things do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in increments so gradual You couldn't identify the exact second the dark became something else. Grey became lilac. Lilac became a thin line of gold at the horizon's edge. Then the orange arrived, and then the rose, spreading wide and unhurried across the water's surface, turning the Pacific into something that looked briefly like it had been lit from underneath. Claire watched it, and felt something in her chest that was almost unbearable in its simplicity. This was the last morning. In 3 hours, there would be checkout and luggage, and a bus back to the airport, and the specific, crushing normalcy of returning to a life that would look exactly as she'd left it. She would sit in her window seat on the flight home and open her laptop, and the city would receive her back without ceremony, the way cities do. Ethan would be 20 rows behind her or 20 rows ahead, and it would all become something that had almost happened. She felt him shift beside her. He turned to look at her, and she knew before he spoke that whatever came next was going to matter. "I don't want to leave here pretending this was just a work retreat," he said. His voice was low and direct, the way it always was. No performance in it, no careful construction. Just the words, placed plainly in the morning air between them. Claire felt her throat tighten. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. It was right there, assembled and ready, the truest thing she'd thought in months. She could feel it pressing forward, something about the balcony in Manhattan and the silence on the bluff, and the way his hand had felt holding hers, and how she'd been awake most of the night because of a slow dance that hadn't even ended with a kiss. She opened her mouth, and the fear arrived first, quick and familiar, the way old reflexes always are. Her throat closed around the honest answer, and her face rearranged itself automatically. That practiced smile, the armor she'd worn so long, she sometimes forgot it was armor. "You're very dramatic for 7 in the morning," she said lightly. She heard how it landed, saw the very small, very controlled way his expression absorbed it. Not hurt exactly, but something quieter. A door closing gently rather than slamming. He turned back to the ocean. "Right," he said, quietly. Just that. Claire looked down at the sand between her palms and felt the word sitting in her chest like a stone. "I'm going to grab coffee before the session," she said, standing, brushing sand from her joggers with hands that were not entirely steady. Ethan nodded without looking up. She walked back toward the resort, and with every step the distance between her and that moment on the sand increased, and some part of her understood with complete clarity that she was making a mistake and kept walking anyway. Behind her, the sun finished rising. Ethan stayed where he was. New York received her back without ceremony. That was the thing about the city. It didn't adjust for you, didn't slow down or soften its edges, because you'd returned from somewhere that had quietly rearranged something inside you. The taxi from JFK moved through the same traffic, the same horns, the same particular grey of a Monday morning on the expressway, and Manhattan rose ahead of her through the window exactly as it always had, indifferent, enormous, entirely unimpressed by whatever had happened to her on a stretch of California coastline over the past 3 days. Claire told herself this was fine, grounding even. This was her city, her life, her terms. She was back at her desk by 2 in the afternoon. The week moved the way weeks do when you're working hard enough to keep the quieter thoughts at bay. Meetings, deliverables, a presentation that required 2 late nights, and a level of focus that should have left no room for anything else. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, filling the hours so completely that the edges left no space for things she hadn't decided how to feel about yet. Ethan was in the office. Of course he was. He was professional, courteous, present in meetings, focused, thoughtful in the way he always was. He didn't avoid her. That would have been obvious, and Ethan Cross was never obvious, but he didn't seek her out either. No lingering after meetings, no appearing beside her at the coffee machine. No messages. The absence of messages was its own specific thing. Claire noticed it the way you notice a sound that stops, not immediately, but in the silence afterward, when you realize the air is different and you can't unhear the quiet. She checked her phone with a frequency she found embarrassing upon reflection. Not waiting, she told herself, just checking, the way anyone checks, routinely, without meaning. She went out on Thursday night with friends from college, a wine bar in the West Village, low lighting, good conversation, the kind of evening that should have reset her entirely. She laughed genuinely at least 3 times. She ordered the good bottle. She was present in all the ways that counted. She was home by 11, standing in her kitchen in the silence of her apartment, and the evening just dissipated, like it hadn't quite taken. She stood at her window with a glass of water and looked at the city. Somewhere in that grid of lit windows and dark ones, Ethan was in his apartment. She didn't know which building, which neighborhood exactly, which window. That felt strange suddenly. How little geography she had for him outside the context of work. She knew how he took his coffee. She knew the sound of his laugh from across a crowded room. She knew what his hand felt like holding hers along a rocky coastline in the fog. She didn't know his address. There was something quietly absurd about that. She picked up her phone on Friday evening without deciding to, opened it, went to messages, found his name, and there it was, their last exchange, 3 weeks old, something logistical about a shared document before the retreat. Professional, entirely unremarkable. She stared at it. She typed, "I've been thinking about what you said on the beach." She looked at the words for a moment, deleted them. Typed, "I owe you an honest conversation." Looked at that one longer, deleted it too, closed the app, put the phone face down on the counter, and stood there with both palms flat on the cool marble, looking at the dark rectangle of it like it had personally failed her. She went to bed without sending anything. In the morning there was still nothing from him. She had not expected there to be. Ethan was not the kind of man who chased, and she understood that now with a clarity that was both clarifying and devastating. He had put something real on the table on that beach at dawn, with the entire Pacific behind him, and the first light coming in, and she had made a joke of it, and he had received that with quiet dignity and closed the door softly and gone back to his life. He would not reopen it. She knew that. The knowledge sat in her chest all weekend like something with weight and corners. She reorganized her kitchen on Saturday, which she had not done in 2 years. She ran 6 miles on Sunday, 2 more than usual. She called her mother and talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential. Sunday night she sat on her couch with the television on and not watched, and let herself finally feel without managing it, without redirecting it, the specific ache of a moment she'd been given and handed back, and the question she couldn't stop turning over in the quiet. What exactly was she so afraid of? She didn't have a clean answer, but she was beginning to understand that not having one was no longer a reason to stay still. She didn't plan it. That was the part she couldn't quite explain afterward. Not to Priya, who asked twice, not to herself in the more honest moments before sleep. There had been no decision made at a kitchen table, no resolve built slowly over a carefully considered afternoon. One moment she was sitting on her couch on a Friday evening, with her second glass of wine untouched on the coffee table, and the next she was in her coat and her boots, and standing at the elevator with her keys in her hand, her heart doing something loud and irregular behind her ribs. She knew his building. She'd dropped a shared folder to his home address once, months ago, a work thing, the kind of administrative detail that lodges in memory without asking permission. Upper West Side, a pre-war building on Riverside with a dark green awning, and a doorman who looked like he'd seen everything, and found none of it particularly surprising. The doorman called up without expression. There was a pause on the intercom that lasted long enough for her to consider leaving. Then, "Send her up." The elevator was old and slow and gave her entirely too much time to think. She thought about turning around. She thought about what she would say. She thought about how she'd spent weeks being precise and protected and strategic, and how none of that had done anything, except leave her standing in her own kitchen on a Sunday night, reorganizing spice racks at 11 p.m., because the silence had become intolerable. The elevator opened on the 7th floor. Ethan was already at the door. He was in a grey t-shirt and dark jeans, no shoes. A book held loosely at his side with one finger marking the page, like she'd interrupted something quiet and ordinary. His expression when he saw her was not surprised exactly. It was more careful than that. The expression of someone who has trained themselves not to assume. Claire stood in the hallway and looked at him and felt every prepared sentence she'd constructed in the taxi dissolve completely. "I don't have a speech," she said. "Okay," he said. "I had one in the elevator. It was quite good, actually, very structured." I believe you, she exhaled, looked down at her boots for a moment, then back up at him. I let go of your hand on that beach because I was scared. Not of you, of what I felt, of how fast it got real and how little control I had over any of it. She paused, kept going because stopping now would mean starting over, and she didn't trust herself to start over. I've spent 3 weeks trying to get back to normal and I can't. I reorganized my entire kitchen. I ran 8 miles on a Sunday. I stared at your name in my phone for 20 minutes on 4 separate occasions and closed the app every single time. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more significant. And I'm more afraid of never feeling what I feel when you look at me than I am of any of the rest of it, she said. So, that's what I have. Instead of the speech. The hallway was very quiet. Ethan looked at her for a moment, that steady, unhurried way he had, like he was giving her words the respect of actually landing before he responded to them. Then he opened the door wider. She walked in. His apartment was warm and low-lit, books on every surface, a record playing something soft in the background that she didn't immediately recognize. It smelled like him. Cedar, something clean, the faint trace of whatever he'd been drinking, something warm and uncomplicated. He set the book down on the side table and turned to face her, and before she could say anything else or construct another sentence to hide behind, he crossed the distance between them and pulled her in, not dramatically, not urgently, just completely, both arms around her, her face against his neck, his chin resting at her temple, one hand moving slowly up her back the way you touch something you've been careful with. She felt the tension she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, in her shoulders, behind her sternum, in the specific tight place beneath her jaw, release in increments, like a fist slowly unclenching. She closed her eyes. His heartbeat was steady under her cheek. The record kept playing. Outside, the city moved through its Friday night without them, indifferent as always, and for once she was grateful for it, grateful that New York asked nothing, noticed nothing, simply continued. You stared at my name for 20 minutes 4 times, he said quietly above her head. She laughed against his shoulder, a real one, unguarded, the kind that arrives before you can decide whether to allow it. Don't make it weird, she said. His arms tightened slightly around her. I won't, he said, and then, after a beat, it was 6 times for me. She pulled back just enough to look at his face. He looked back at her with those steady, dark eyes, entirely serious, not performing anything. She reached up and kissed him, slow and certain, and nothing at all like a dare. They went back in October, not for work, not for any reason that required justification to a calendar or an expense report. Ethan had simply said, one evening in late September, while they were finishing dinner at her kitchen table, with the windows open and the first real chill of autumn moving through the apartment, I want to go back to Monterey. And Claire had looked at him across the remnants of pasta and a half-finished bottle of red and said, okay. Just that. No negotiation, no scheduling anxiety, no 3-day deliberation about whether it was too much too soon. She was learning to do that. Say the simple thing. Let it be enough. The resort looked different in October. The same bones, the same wooden decks and stone corridors and Pacific views, but quieter now. The summer crowds gone, the light lower and more golden, the ocean a deeper shade of grey-green that suited the season. The fog came in earlier in the evenings and stayed longer in the mornings. The air had a bite to it that Manhattan air in autumn never quite achieved. Cleaner, colder, salt-heavy in a way that arrived in the lungs like a reminder that the world was larger than any city. They had the same wing. Different rooms, one between them this time, a small irony that Claire noticed and said nothing about, though she caught Ethan's expression when the front desk mentioned it and saw the corner of his mouth move. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything, he said. You were about to. I was going to say the view looks the same. You were not. He picked up his bag and walked toward the corridor, and she followed, and she was smiling at his back the whole way and made no effort to hide it. The first day they did almost nothing. A late breakfast on the main terrace, coffee that was better than it had any right to be, A slow walk along the bluff path they'd taken months ago. This time, without the unspoken weight of things neither had said yet. The rocks were the same, the wind was colder. When they reached the descent where he'd offered her his hand in April, he offered it again without comment, and she took it. And this time when their fingers settled together, there was nothing to analyze about it. It was just his hand and hers, and the path ahead. They had dinner at a small table near the window, the ocean dark beyond the glass. They talked the way they'd learned to talk, not filling space, not performing, but actually saying things. She told him about her father, something she rarely told anyone on a timeline this short, about how his particular brand of emotional unavailability had become the blueprint she'd spent 2 decades unconsciously replicating in every relationship she'd entered and then sabotaged. Ethan listened without interrupting, without fixing, without reaching immediately for the consolation that would have made it easier, but smaller. When she finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me that." 4 words. She felt them settle somewhere important. He told her about the year after his mother died, the way grief had arrived late for him, 6 months after the funeral, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and how he'd spent a long time afterward being very competent and very empty, and mistaking one for the other. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held it, and they stayed like that through the rest of the wine. Later, much later, the resort nearly silent around them, the kind of late that only exists when you've lost track of time without minding. They were on the deck. Their deck. The wooden balcony over the Pacific where the season had turned the water silver black, and the stars were extraordinary. And the cold was the good kind, the kind that makes you move closer to whoever is beside you. Claire had her head on his shoulder, both of them wrapped in the blanket she'd pulled from the room, a bottle of wine between them that neither was drinking with any urgency. The ocean below was doing its ancient, patient work. She could feel the slow rhythm of his breathing beneath her cheek. "You knew?" she said quietly. Not an accusation, just something she'd been turning over for months, waiting for the right place to set it down. That night on the terrace in Manhattan. "You knew I was bluffing." Ethan was quiet for a moment. The water moved below them. "I knew you needed to believe you'd launched the dare," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the confession. "So, I let you." Claire lifted her head to look at him. "That's extremely calculated," she said. "It worked." She laughed. That real one, the unguarded one that she had spent years keeping in reserve, and had somehow, over these past months, started spending freely. He turned to look at her when she laughed, the way he always did, like it was something worth turning toward. She settled back against his shoulder. The blanket was warm. His arm around her was warm. The stars were doing what stars do when you finally stop being too busy to notice them. "I almost said everything that morning on the beach," she said softly. "I had it all right there." "I know," he said, "and I made a joke." "You did. And you just let me walk away." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, slow and unhurried. "You needed to come back on your own terms," he said. "So I waited." Claire looked out at the ocean, the same ocean that had witnessed all of it, the midnight silences, the rocky path, the unanswered questions and the answered ones, the morning she'd walked away from something true because she was afraid, and the Friday night months later when she'd finally stopped being afraid enough to go find it. "Patient," she said. "When it matters," he said. She turned her face up toward his, and he met her there, a kiss that held everything the first one hadn't had time for. Slow and warm and entirely unhurried. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything because it already knows what it is. Below them, the Pacific kept moving. It had been doing this long before either of them arrived, and it would keep doing it long after. But for now on this deck, under these stars, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and salt, this was enough. This was, quietly and completely, everything. She had spent years believing that control was the same thing as safety, that keeping her hands on every variable, every outcome, every door, was wisdom. It wasn't. It was just loneliness with better posture. Love didn't ask permission. It never does. It simply waited, patient as the ocean, quiet as a hand held on a rocky path, until she was finally brave enough to stop pretending she didn't want it. Is there something you've been brave enough to want lately? If this story touched something in you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Those comments mean more than you know. And if you want more, deeper, more intense, uninterrupted, the link is in the first pinned comment. A new story waiting for you every single day. See you in the next one.